This is not going to be a normal build video. Stick with me and I'll walk you through all of this. It's going to be interesting. Let's start with the GPU. We're going to go with a Asus Dual RTX 2060. It's actually a pretty decent GPU, and I'll come back to that here in a second. But it's also going to keep us within the budget that I wanted to keep it in. The 2060, I think, is kind of underrated. It performs about the same as a 1070 Ti, which is an 8 gig card, and the 2060 is a 6 gig card, right? And it performs better than a RTX 3050 8 gig version. There's a 6 gig version for the 3050, but I'm talking specifically about the 8 gig version. So the 2060 performs better than that. Yeah, I think it's a kind of an underrated card, probably because it comes with 6 gigs of VRAM instead of 8. If it came with 8, I think more people would be interested in this. And if you go on the market, on the used market, you'll probably find it for anywhere from like 125 to up to 170, somewhere around there. I got these, each of these, I bought 5 in total for about $100 a pop. So yeah. And for the CPU, if you'll recall, in a few of my videos, I mentioned that I bought the Ryzen 5 5500 at about $85 a pop. Interestingly, this CPU performs better than the 3600, which is a common CPU for a lot of PC flippers that are doing budget builds and things like that. And the 3600 works about the same as, I'm going to say, the 10600K, the i5 10600K. The 5500 works better than both that one and the 3600. So for $85, kind of hard to beat from a budget standpoint and a performance standpoint as far as cost per frame. For storage, we're going to go with a 1 terabyte NVMe from Kingspec, and it was on sale for $45. So I picked up a few of these. For RAM, we're gonna, I want to say like 3-4 months ago, maybe a little bit longer, I picked up a kit of 16 gigs of DDR4 at 3200 megahertz, white, obviously, with RGB from Corsair, the Vengeance brand. Yeah, it was I picked that up for a pretty decent price at about $50, I think it was. The CPU cooler, we're gonna go with the tried and true CPU cooler, which is the ID Cooling SE214XT ARGB, which is kind of a long name for a CPU cooler. For the motherboard, we're gonna go with the ASRock B550M Pro SE. And this is a decent motherboard. I picked that up for like $80 on Newegg. A couple of downsides for this motherboard, it being a budget motherboard, it does not have integrated Wi-Fi. But if I wanted to, I mean, there's a decent number of, a large number of people that have gaming PCs that don't use Wi-Fi, so I'm not too worried about that. But if I was worried about it, I could always use a USB Wi-Fi dongle, or get a PCIe Wi-Fi card and put it in there. But that raises my costs somewhere between $20 to $35. This also does not have a USB Type-C header, but the case that we're going to go with does not have a USB Type-C on the front panel, so not a big deal there. It also doesn't have a USB Type-C on the back. It being a budget build, most people that are buying a budget PC realize that certain sacrifices will have to be made. One of them potentially being not having any USB Type-C ports. For the power supply, we're going to use a used power supply. And this is repurposed from a different PC that I had bought on Facebook Marketplace that had a 4060 in it. And so we're gonna value this at about 30 bucks. And the reason why I wanna value it at 30 bucks is because, you know, some people will value it at 0 when they're doing a new build to manage those costs, but it still costs me money to get this power supply in that PC. And so if I remove that cost and don't account for it in a different build that I use it in, then I'm actually shrinking my profitability over time. And the more often I do that, sooner or later, I could get to a break-even point or lose money, which kind of defeats the purpose of doing this kind of thing, right? And so it's always important to look at these components and don't think of them as free, no matter how long they've been sitting on your shelf, and create a value for that you're going to account for in your costs, so that when you come up with a sales price, you're still making a profit, right? Okay, so I mean, you could do a pass-through cost on it, right? So if I value it at $30 and I don't want to make any margin on this power supply, then I could account for all the other parts, build in my margin for my sales price, and then add the $30 on the back end, and that becomes my sales price. You could do it that way you at least break even and recoup the cost of the power supply. So a couple different ways you can do it. Case, we're going to go with the Montech Air 100 ARGB in white. Again, if you've seen that other white build that I did for 800, that was the case I was originally going to use in that build, but I ended up using a Phanteks XT Pro Ultra in white on that build for a few reasons, and you know, I'm not going to get into those reasons because it's in the other video. These are the components that we're going to use, and so why don't we get to building? As usual, we'll do a review of everything from an install process goes after we post and install Windows and do some benchmarks, and then we'll talk about the components that we used and what the build process was like. Here we go. It's always nice when everything comes on. Looks like we're going to get a post here. That's the signal. And there we go. All right, so ran into a few issues. So I have another SSD, and it's got all my games and stuff like that that I can do benchmarks on. And so rather than downloading and installing and all that stuff for the games that I use, like Cyberpunk 2077, and I've got Starfield and Baldur's Gate 3, I think, is on it, and I think Red Dead 2 is on it. And so it goes a lot faster for me if I just install that SSD into a new built system to run the benchmarks, right? On this one, I had the primary drive, the Kingspec, in the top spot, the spot above the M.2 which is right above the GPU. And then there's a second M.2 slot near the headers of the bottom of the board, right? And so I had installed the drive I normally use for benchmarking in that M.2 slot. And when I would power it on, it would light up for half a second and then power off. You know, I swapped out GPUs, and I swapped out power supplies. It kept on doing the same thing. And so now I'm thinking that maybe there's like somehow a short in that M.2 slot. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna swap out that SSD. All right, let's see if it repeats itself. There's the post. So we should be fine. It looks like we're booting into Windows. So that's good. That's actually pretty good news. Because if we had a short in the motherboard somehow, or at least a short in that M.2 slot, then we can't ethically sell this PC with a known issue in the motherboard unless we wanted to sell it with that disclaimer in the description of the PC, and then we would have to sell it at a discount, obviously. I want people that buy PCs from me to know exactly what they're getting for their money, so that they can be confident in their purchase. If they're not confident in their purchase, I don't really want them to buy it, right? So let's put that drive back into the primary spot, and then put my other drive in the secondary spot and see what happens. And if we get a repeat, then we might have a power supply issue. I mean, the only other thing we could do is we could put my main drive into the primary slot and then the Kingspec drive into the secondary slot, see if that happens again. So we'll go from there and figure it out as we go. All right, so this is the original orientation where I ran into a problem, where the Kingspec was in the top slot for M.2, and the drive I normally use to test PCs with is down at the bottom right there. All right, so let's see what happens now. And there it is. There's the issue right there. See that? It'll blink for a second as if powering on, and then it'll shut right down. Let's swap in my drive into the primary spot, test that, and then the final test would be to have that in there, if it works, to have that in the primary spot, and then putting the Kingspec into the second slot and seeing what happens there. If it happens again when the two drives are swapped, then for some reason the power supply doesn't like the draw that's happening on the motherboard. I don't think it's a problem with the power supply, because without this configuration it works just fine. And I put a tester on it and everything, and it seemed to read fine. And it's a brand new power supply, so I don't think that's the issue. For some reason, if it repeats itself in a flip-flop configuration of the SSDs, then for some reason it does not like that. And so, you know, we'll see where we go from there. All right, let's run a couple of more tests. Let's see what happens with the drives flip-flopped. No, same thing. All right, so last move, we're gonna now remove the Kingspec drive. All right, this will tell us, I think, if it comes on. So it's the drive, which is interesting. For some reason, this motherboard does not like that drive, which is weird. It's because I use that drive all the time to test all the past PCs that I've built, not just on this channel, but others that I hadn't recorded. Yeah, that is interesting. I don't know why it would have a problem with that drive. And so I guess the next thing we can test is we could put a similar drive in there if I've got one in stock and see if it does the same thing. So let's take a look. Yeah, it looks like it's a SN580. I might need to go online and look around, see if I can find anybody running into a similar issue. I don't know if I've got another Western Digital SN580 on hand. Maybe I need to test that drive in another rig and see what happens there. I tested it in another rig just like the day before I did this build. So, and it worked fine. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the GPU back in. I'm going to use my enclosure for this drive to make sure that it's readable. Make sure that there's nothing wrong suddenly with this Western Digital drive. All right, let's power this boy on, and then we're going to plug in the drive in this enclosure and see if it's readable. As you can see, power's on just fine without that drive in there, so it's just that drive for some reason. All right. Oh, and we don't have a USB Type-C port on here, so you need to get an adapter. The bonus to doing this kind of stuff is I got all kinds of different cables, so, you know, if I find that I need something, I usually have it. Okay, it's lit, so it's powered. I don't remember if this is a data cable, but it looks like it's a data cable because it's thick. And maybe not. Maybe it is not a data cable. So let's try a different cable because I've got more. There it is. Seems to be reading it fine. All right. So nothing wrong with the drive. If I had another Gen 3 drive, that would be my last test to see if this board for some reason has a problem. Or actually my second to last, my very last one would be to go out and get a Western Digital SN580 and putting it in there and seeing if it does the same thing. And then I know that for some reason, this motherboard or the power supply or both, for some reason, does not like that drive. And I'm going to have to assume that it's the motherboard that's having a problem with it, not the power supply, because the power supply can't tell the difference between one drive and another. It just needs to know how much power it needs to provide, right? And so that I don't think it's the power supply. I think it's the motherboard. For some reason has an issue with this particular drive. I haven't tested out having two drives in the motherboard without it being one of them being the Western Digital, but I don't think that's the issue. Took that Kingspec drive and put it into the second M.2 slot, and it did fine. It powered on and everything and booted up as you saw. So I don't think it's either of those slots, whether they're both populated or just one's populated. I don't think that has anything to do with it. I think it's this drive, for some reason, doesn't get along with this motherboard. But it is an interesting problem. It's a problem I haven't run across yet. Write down in the comments if you've come across this problem before, whether it's with the Western Digital SN580 or if it's another drive where you had a similar issue and it turned out to be a drive and motherboard not getting along, or if you found out that it was something else that was causing the problem, let me know. But all symptoms point to just the motherboard and the drive not getting along. So we're going to move on and start doing some benchmarks and testing out this PC, because it's pretty much obviously done. And once we do that, then I'll go into further detail about other things I ran into, other issues I ran into with this particular build. All right, so we're finished with the PC, and I didn't record all those benchmarks, mostly because I just didn't have time after some of the things we went through. And yeah, this was a little bit challenging, a lot more challenging than some of the previous builds. And it's not because of any complexity with the hardware. Well, let's talk about it. Let's start with this. Well, this filter right here, this top filter, it's got these holes in it, as you can see. These holes are meant for, like, I'm assuming screws that you would use for either mounting fans or an AIO. If you line it up with the holes on the top, you see how it kind of bleeds out over the edge, and there's this much of the case porosity that isn't being covered by the filter. But if you slide it forward where the entire filter is covering all the porosity at the top of the case, then those holes don't line up, which makes those holes pointless. And so I'm assuming that whatever machining that they do, or whatever automated system that they use to punch these holes, this was somehow punched in the wrong part of the filter. Like, the holes should have been moved back a little bit from where the filter is. So you see how the holes right here are near the top, right? And so I'm thinking that the holes were supposed to start somewhere closer to about right there. And had that happened, then everything would have probably lined up fine. But yeah, so this filter, although it'll still work fine, whatever their intentions were, I haven't seen any other cases have holes punched in for. I think they were trying to do an improved quality of life as far as this kind of thing goes, but they failed miserably at it. It's actually annoying. It's my OCD's like just kicking in. But yeah, so that was one issue. We had a power supply issue. So the Corsair 650, the RX 650M, gave me problems. It was shutting down. And so once I tracked it down on the 3 volt cable was a problem, and or the 3 volt rail. Because it was a used power supply, I wasn't sure how old it was and how long it was used. When something like that happens, that's usually an indicator that the power supply is starting to go out, and so there's no point in trying to utilize it or keep it. And so I tossed that, and in its place I put in a 650 watt power supply from Segotep, whatever. That was a 80 plus gold power supply, and it was brand new. Another thing that was a problem is the side grommets, where like the 24 pin cables coming through. Those things come out pretty easily, and I'm gonna circle back in a second here as to why, but they come out really easily, and they're kind of a bitch to put back in. And so I feel like that they could have sealed those grommets in there, but they would just fall out from just a little bit of pressure in routing the cable through that grommet. And so that was a little bit annoying about this case as well. And you know, like I said, I was going to circle back in a second. So the holes that are in this case, the back holes near the bottom of the motherboard, this side hole right here, this side hole is fine, but this side hole right here, the holes right there, and the holes at top for routing cables and stuff, those things are slightly smaller than what you would normally see in a case, and so it made actually routing cables through those holes just a little bit more tedious than it needed to be, or a little more frustrating than it needed to be. And so that was a bit annoying. I didn't like that at all. That, especially since, you know, I had to switch out the power supply, so that kind of made it stand out a little bit more as far as it being an issue. Had I not had to do that, then it might have not stood out as much to me. The other thing was this fan right here. Because of the shallowness of the case, it sits so close to where the I/O backplate for the motherboard would slide in when you place the motherboard, and so you kind of had to angle it and then shift it in there. It was either that or removing the fan and then putting the motherboard in and putting the fan back in, right? Which either way, it was a little bit annoying because you had to maneuver the motherboard and then make sure that you maneuvered it in such a way that the holes aligned with the standoffs, or you remove the fan and then put the fan back on once you put it in the motherboard. And as you saw earlier, I did run into an issue with this motherboard, and after running through those tests, I did look online to see if anybody else was having problems. At first, there was really no results until I kept on refining my search here and there until I found this. And as you can see, this chart shows you a list of SSDs that don't play well with this motherboard. And so it would be nice if ASRock had put that in their spec sheets for this motherboard under the support or specifications tabs when you look up this motherboard, rather than having to search all over the place and then having to accidentally come across a link that shot me over there. I don't like the case. The case gave me more problems than it was worth. I got a few more of these motherboards, so once I go through those, I doubt that I'm going to use those in the future. And I would not recommend anybody getting that ASRock motherboard. And I want to say it's the ASRock B550M Pro SE. And it's white with like black accents on it, and it looks nice, but it's got the SSD problem with it. It does not have a integrated Wi-Fi. It does not have a USB Type-C header, and it does not have a USB Type-C port in the back. And so because of those four things, primarily because of the SSD issue, I can't recommend that motherboard to anybody, because, you know, people are going to have a hard time with it and not necessarily know why they're having a hard time with it. And so if I had to guess, I'd say that ASRock right now has a high RMA count for that motherboard, but that's pure speculation on my part. Other than that, we stayed within our budget, which came out after sales tax, $586.04. So let me know down in the comments what you think about this PC and this build, and let me also know if you ran into some similar issues with other ASRock boards or even other motherboards as far as them not taking specific SSDs. Which I do find interesting. This is the first time I've run across this. So yeah, what you see here is the result of one thing going wrong. There was a cascade of events, all right? And sometimes things just don't go as planned, and it can be very frustrating, especially if you're having a hard time figuring it out. This PC case came with this hub, and this is a straight RGB hub. It's not a there's no fan hub on this. It's just the 3-pin 5-volt connector, and this is what came with the case. It was screwed right here, right, and or down here actually. When I powered on the PC, the fans that were pre-installed on this case, normally when you turn on RGB fans on a case on an initial startup, you're going to get like this rainbow effects. That's what you'll normally see. Anyways, so these fans stayed blue. Didn't change colors at all, just stayed a static blue. And I started wondering, well, what the hell's going on with that? Because the CPU cooler was doing what it would normally do, is that rainbow color, right? After playing around with it, what I did was first I hooked up the RGB cable for the CPU cooler onto this hub, and it started doing the same thing. So then, okay, maybe it's programmable and it just starts off at static blue. And so I ran some tests and everything. I even downloaded and installed OpenRGB and played around with that, and it wasn't doing anything. It wasn't reading anything. And I connected each of the individual fans directly to the motherboard, and they did fine. When you started up, they did the rainbow color, and you were able to change the colors. But as soon as they got installed on or hooked up to this hub, went back doing the same thing. So I'm thinking, okay, well, this hub is worthless, right? And so then I happen to have a couple of other fan and RGB hubs on hand for other potential future builds, and so I hooked one of those up, and that's this bad boy right here. And this hub has both RGB and fan headers on it, right, or connectors. And so I hooked everything up. I took the fans off the splitter that it was on, hooked everything up to this hub, turned it on, and everything worked fine. And just to make sure that the reset button worked on the PC, I hit the reset button. All of a sudden, all the lights start blinking, it turns off, and then whenever I tried to hit the power, it would the fans would blink on for a couple of quick flashes, and then it would power off, and it kept on doing that. What's going on with that? It can't be the CPU. I removed and tested and reinstalled the RAM, and the RAM checked out fine. I was pretty sure it wasn't the CPU, so I wasn't too worried about the CPU. I started thinking maybe the motherboard, and I started also thinking, well, maybe the power supply. So I tested the power supply. I unhooked everything, including the front panel power switch and the reset header. I took those off, and then I started manually powering on the PC. For those of you unaware, you can jumper those two pins to power on a PC. So then I reinstalled the original hub, and it went back to doing the blue thing, and it would power on. So I'm thinking, okay, maybe the hub's the problem. So I changed out the hub for another hub. It would flicker on and then power off, flicker on and then power off, no matter how many times. And I even turned off just in case the power supply needed to be reset for some reason. I powered everything off, waited a few hours, came back, and it was still doing it. I removed the 24 pin, the CPU pin, the PCI cables, tested the power supply, everything tested fine. But as soon as I hooked up the PCI cable to the GPU, it would do the exact same thing. So now I'm thinking, okay, the PCIe cable is bad, but there was a secondary one, so I tried that one, and that did the same thing. I was thinking, okay, well, maybe it's the GPU. Maybe somehow I jacked up the GPU, which I highly doubted, but, you know, it's best to remove all the potential problems. So I took out this GPU, put in another GPU that I knew was working, and it did the same thing. So I knew it wasn't the GPU. Just to cut to the chase, if you hook up all the fans and all the RGB cables, so there were 4 fan cables, 4 RGB cables for each, one for each fan, and even the RGB cable for the CPU cooler. But I took that off and put that back on the motherboard. But if you have all 4 of the fans hooked up, both the RGB and the fans, that's what there was. For some reason, it's drawing too much power, and the power supply didn't like it. And so it would not let me power the PC on. And so I removed all the fans from the hub and then reinstalled the fan splitter. And so now we're at this point of whether or not this thing is going to power on. And so I'm a little worried that it won't, because if it doesn't, I'm probably going to take a hammer to all of this. Let's see what happens. All right. Still doing it. Where's my hammer? Still doing it. Okay, so now I'm thinking that maybe the power supply just isn't strong enough. But it's a 650 watt power supply. In between all these components, this shouldn't be drawing more than about like 300, 350 watts, maybe 400. All right, I'm back. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna put this aside because I've got other videos that I wanna make, and I don't wanna spend days figuring this out, because if replacing those fans doesn't work, then, you know, it might be hammer time. Stop. Hammer time. So for now, I'm going to put this stuff aside, and I'm going to chalk this one up as a loss until I find enough patience to work on the case and this build and finish it up. I had hoped that it was gonna go quickly and easily, but that was not the case. And you know, the funny thing is that most of my builds, relatively speaking, the build itself usually goes pretty quick and easy and smooth. But I ran into so many issues with this build that I need to take a break from it. And so, you know, once in a while that kind of happens. You just gotta take the bad with the good. Hopefully revisit this project at a later date. Little frustrating, pretty disappointing, but you know, it is what it is. So see you next time. All right, I'm back because I'm stubborn, and rather than taking a hammer to this PC, I ran a few more tests, and I came to the conclusion that my problem was actually the power supply again. So let me show you this. So this is the power supply that I replaced the Corsair RM650 with, which is the Segotep 650 watt. And this has the power ratings on it, right? So for the 12 volt rail, 5 volt rail, 3.3 volt. And what I replaced it with was this, which is a power supply I've used in the past that has worked well for me. It's a PowerSpec 650 watt semi-modular. And this is an 80 plus bronze power supply. When you're using an RGB hub and or fan hub, Well, that's going to call for some voltage and some amps, right? And so that amp draw is and voltage draw is going to be required by that controller in order to have it work. And so once I put this in, everything worked fine, as you can see. And this controller actually comes with a remote control, right? At first, I was at kind of a loss of why this 650 watt worked, but the other one didn't. And then I started thinking about the power rails and everything. And so the 5-volt rail is really what I believe I'm looking at as far as the issue at hand. Might also be 3.3 volt, but I think it's the 5 volt because it's for RGB. The 3-pin version is 5 volt header. If I look at the Segotep power supply on the 5-volt rail, 15 amp draw up to 103 watts. Whereas the PowerSpec on the 5-volt is 22 amps, so a 7 amp increase up to 120 watts on the power, so another 17 watts on top of it. And so I think that's what was causing the problem, because I don't see any other reason why the symptoms were what the symptoms were, in that it would try to power on but would not power on, meaning that, you know, it'd quickly blink on and then power off. And so, yeah, that's the only conclusion I can come to. The funny thing is that on the 12-volt rail, the Segotep is actually a better performer at 648 watts, whereas the PowerSpec on the 12-volt rail is 585 watts. So from a 12-volt rail standpoint, the Segotep is actually the better product. But as far as an overall power distribution, I think the PowerSpec is actually a little more even keeled across the rails. So anyways, I hope, I know I didn't get a chance to do any benchmarks or anything for this particular build because there just wasn't any time. Thanks for joining me, and thanks for watching me come close to destroying a PC, because oh my God, I can't believe the number of problems I ran into with this. It's like all the problems I could have run into in building PCs all went into this PC. Again, thanks for joining me, and I hope to see you in the next one.